Hello, everybody. It is March the 12th, 2025. About 3 years ago, I had David Enrich from the New York Times, the business investigations editor, although he's recently changed that position, on the show, talking about an interesting book that he had out at the Times called Servant of the Damned, Giant Law Firms, Donald Trump and the Corruption of Justice. David has a new book out today. It's called Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment and the Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. But before we talk about murdering the truth, I have to ask you, David, he's joining us from New York, not the Times office where he lives. I have to ask you, David, about your take on this Perkins Coie scandal, given that you're an expert on law firms and politics. What do you make of it?
It's crazy. Like, I have not seen anything like this before. Big caveat, important caveat, which is that I'm not the one covering this for the Times, so I'm not versed on all of the intricacies. And what's more, this week, when I know there have been a lot of legal developments in that, I have been so obsessed with promoting my book that I'm way behind on keeping up with the news. But so those caveats aside, I mean, it's clearly, it seems like an attempt by the Trump administration to punish lawyers and law firms that have represented Trump's political enemies. And that is not the way the law usually works in this country. And I found it interesting to see Perkins is obviously fighting back, which does not surprise me. But I've been a little surprised that the rest of the broader legal industry, including big corporate law firms that have represented Democrats and Republicans in the past, have kind of, the cat's got their tongue. And
yeah, I was talking to my wife about this, who's a lawyer at Google, and she thought that it was time for all the corporate law firms to get together and issue something suggesting that this is ill-advised. How does it change Servants of the Damned, your book on giant law firms? Does it change it in any way?
Well, I don't think it really changes it, but I think it's an interesting kind of addendum to it in a way. I mean, Servants of the Damned focused in large part on one law firm, Jones Day, that was, among many other things, had been representing Trump and his campaign, and a lot of their lawyers had gone on to work in Trump's White House. And partly as a result of that work, had faced kind of an internal uprising from lawyers and some clients that objected to the work that the firm was doing for Trump. And the law firm's leadership responded to that uprising, and they took a very kind of inflexible approach, which was that we work for our clients and we do not abandon our clients even when they're politically unpopular. And the firm drew a lot of flack for that inflexibility, but they viewed it as kind of a point of pride. And so one of the things I've been surprised about watching this whole Perkins Coie situation unfold is that a firm like Jones Day has not, kind of, at least that I'm aware of, has not spoken out about the dangers that this poses to itself and other law firms. And Jones Day is in a position where, given their kind of conservative credentials and their previous ties to Trump and his administration, that you would think they would be in a position where they could say, hey, wait a minute, when we were representing you, we stood up to people on the left who were criticizing us. Why now is another law firm that historically has been aligned with Democrats, why now it's not okay for them to now be under fire because it wasn't okay when it happened to us? So their silence. And again, I should caveat this again by saying I have not heard them say anything or seen them say anything. It's possible I've missed that. But assuming they have, in fact, been silent, I find that kind of surprising.
Yeah, it is surprising and troubling, I think. Let's get to the new book, David. Murder the Truth. You're not messing around with the title. Fear the First Amendment and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. It's not an entirely new departure for you. I mean, in some ways, it's connected with Servants of the Damned. It's about the creeping authoritarianism in America, but this very much in terms of press freedom. I mean, sometimes when you talk to authors, they say, well, it was the publisher's title. Well, I don't really think that.
Oh, this was my title.
So is this not an exaggeration? Is the Trump administration really in the business now, or at least some portions of it, and particularly Clarence Thomas, who of course is not part of, officially at least, of the Trump administration? Are they really in the business of trying to murder the truth?
Well, I can answer that in any number of ways. I mean, first of all, it is definitely the case that Trump and his allies often use lies and distortions and conspiracy theories to try to advance their agenda. But so, yeah, I think you could make the argument that they are trying to murder the truth, I guess, at least in some cases. But look, I mean, I wrote this book and picked this title. I mean, the book was largely, but not entirely, done before the election. And the title was certainly picked before the election. And I started working on this back in kind of late 2022. And at which point Trump was still kind of facing banishment from the political mainstream. And so I started writing this and did most of the work when I had no particular reason to think Trump would be back in the White House by the time it published. And to me, the murdering of the truth is not something that is at all peculiar to what the Trump administration is sometimes trying to do. It's part of a much broader campaign by powerful people and institutions, whether they're politicians or corporate executives or big companies or just run-of-the-mill rich people, that when they are faced with journalism or even public criticism that they don't like and they object to, they have started to deploy really aggressive legal tactics to get people to stop criticizing them or stop investigating them. And the title is actually a reference. It's a quote that a British lawmaker, an MP, used when talking about Britain's kind of censorious laws. The UK obviously does not have the First Amendment, and it is much easier, for example, for people to sue news outlets or others for defamation than it is in the US. But the quote from this British lawmaker was just, it seems so apt and so evocative that I really liked it. So I picked it for my title. I did not pick Servants of the Damned. That was, I can't remember who picked it. It was not me. I like it, but this is one of those cases where I actually take full credit and responsibility for the title.
Good. Well, you're not messing around, David. Let's talk about the First Amendment. You suggest earlier that that's what distinguishes the U.S. and freedom of expression here, media, press expression, and the UK. What exactly is the First Amendment?
Well, it is the first part of the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution. And I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a constitutional historian, but and you're the first person of about a ton of interviewers who've actually asked me that question. But the Constitution was
it's in the subtitle, so
yeah, no, it's a totally valid. I'm not pushing back. I'm marveling at the fact that you're the first one to ask me that. So the First Amendment, the Constitution was written in part as a compromise, and the part of the compromise was that immediately upon passage of the Constitution, there would be the Bill of Rights, which would amend the Constitution to clarify certain things and kind of elaborate upon the explicit personal freedoms and liberties that the framers of the Constitution thought were core to the founding of the United States. And the first of those amendments is the First Amendment, which establishes the right to people practicing freely the exercise of religion, speech, and having freedom of the press. And it prevents Congress or any other governments, whether they're state or federal, from making any laws that restrict the freedom of the press or freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And I think all parts of the First Amendment, I think all parts of the Bill of Rights are really important, and they're core to who we are as Americans, what this country stands for and represents. But I think the First Amendment is first for a reason, which is that free speech rights were considered so important and so crucial, especially given the experiences that our founders and their forefathers had with Britain. And so they embedded as the very First Amendment to the Constitution this notion that it was really important, among other things, to have a free press that would be able to openly criticize and critique people who held positions of power, because that served as a really important check on abuses of that power by the government or by anyone else for that matter.
That's a broad introduction. The book focuses on and this is not a this is not a law school class, and I'm not a lawyer, but it does focus on a particular case, New York Times versus Sullivan. You're with the New York Times, but you weren't back then in 1964. Why is this case, New York Times versus Sullivan, David, so important?
Well, do you want me to explain the history of that case briefly? Because
give us some background to this murdering of the truth. Boom, boom, boom.
Okay, so the New York Times versus Sullivan case, its genesis was an ad that ran in the New York Times in 1960. And it was an ad paid for by supporters of Martin Luther King, who were basically trying to raise money to support King's civil rights movement and also to register voters in southern states like Alabama. And the ad kind of described in great detail the litany of abuses by Southern officials and such kind of the Stalinist violent tactics that they were using to preserve white supremacy in the South. And the gist of the ad was completely true, but the ad also contained some inaccuracies and some exaggerations. And the ad came to the attention of a guy named L.B. Sullivan, who was a city commissioner in Montgomery, Alabama, who happened to have oversight of the city's police department. And the Montgomery Police Department was one of those government authorities that had come out for criticism in this full-page ad in the New York Times. And Sullivan was not named in the ad, but he still decided that he was going to file a lawsuit against the New York Times, claiming that because of the handful of relatively small inaccuracies in the ad, it had impugned the Montgomery Police Department and therefore had defamed him, kind of in effect. And so this case, his lawsuit went to trial in Alabama. It was a white supremacist judge, and the jury was comprised in part of people who happened to be dressed in Confederate costumes, believe it or not. And you will not be surprised to hear that that jury swiftly reached a verdict against the New York Times and for L.B. Sullivan. And that simple victory had very big repercussions. And first of all, the New York Times felt that it had no choice but to pull its reporters out of Alabama and basically stop covering the civil rights movement, because the damages in this case alone were really substantial for the Times, which at the time wasn't nearly as strong financially as it is today. And it also inspired a bunch of other Southern officials to file a whole wave of lawsuits against the Times and other media outlets that had been covering the civil rights movement. And it was basically a deliberate and explicit campaign to get news outlets to start writing about this stuff and stop broadcasting about this stuff, because that was interfering, or it was kind of giving momentum to the civil rights movement. Anyway, the Times appealed the verdict against it. It lost at the Alabama State Supreme Court. It then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which was kind of its last resort. And in 1964, the Supreme Court heard the case and then issued its decision, which was unanimous. And it found that in order to protect the freedom of speech that is part of the First Amendment, journalists and members of the public and everyone else need to have the right to aggressively criticize and interrogate what their public officials are doing. And they need breathing room to do so. So if they get a couple of facts wrong, the way that the ad in the New York Times had gotten a couple of facts wrong, they should not be held liable for that. If they get things deliberately wrong, if they lie, that's a different question. But if you in good faith get some facts wrong, you cannot be held liable for that. And so the standard the court created in this case was called the actual malice standard, which really has nothing to do with like the common understanding of the word malice. What it means is just a legal term, which means that in order for a public figure or public official to win a defamation case, they need to prove not only that the underlying facts were wrong and that they injured this person's reputation, but also that whoever wrote or said the statements at issue did so knowing that what they were saying was false, so they lied, or they acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of what they were saying. So, and the court deliberately created a very high bar to public figures winning defamation cases because they wanted to give journalists and others breathing room to be able to engage in aggressive journalism and really push public figures and scrutinize their activities without being worried that an innocent mistake or a slip up would subject them to ruinous litigation. And so this decision almost instantly transformed journalism. I mean, it emboldened journalists to be a lot more aggressive and accountability seeking in terms of what they were writing. And I mean, it's not a coincidence that in the years immediately after Sullivan, journalists played a big role in exposing wrongdoing in the Vietnam War. They brought Watergate to light.
Yeah, I
And
was going to
those
ask
are,
both those questions of whether we would have had a lot of the reporting about Vietnam or Watergate, of course, the Washington Post expose of Watergate, without New York Times versus Sullivan.
and I think the answer is probably not. I mean, this was a time, starting in 1968, where you had a president, Richard Nixon, who, and with some similarity to today, was really hated the media and had a very, shall we say, expansive view of his powers as president, and was at times using those powers in ways that had never previously been used, and courts would later find were improper. And so I think that news outlets, absent the protections that Sullivan provided, would have been really wary about being as aggressive as they were at investigating the president's affairs and at times criticizing the president's activities. And that I think history tells us that that would have been a real loss for this country.
Given that the Times against Sullivan had a strong racist background, it's particularly ironic, perhaps sadly ironic, that the man behind the call for the reconsideration of this is a certain Clarence Thomas. Is there a racial element to this, David?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that's not that I've really thought about it. I mean, I think Thomas and look, Thomas is someone who has developed over the decades a real kind of searing animosity toward the media because he perceives the media, I think he wrongly perceives the media, but he perceives the media nonetheless as having really tried to destroy him, going way back to his years even before he was nominated to the Supreme Court. And again, I think he's wrong about that, and I think he is kind of misremembering facts. But there's no question that that animates him. That hatred toward the media animates him, and I don't think that is because, I mean, I don't know. It's hard. I don't know where he is on issues of race. And I, as a white guy, am not going to start speculating about that. But so yeah, I don't know if it's relevant, to be honest.
So explain why Clarence Thomas is renewing calls for the reconsideration of this key, in your mind, key case about media freedom in the United States. What's his argument?
Well, he has a bunch of arguments. I mean, the first argument he made, and this was in 2019, was that the plain meaning and the wording and the original understanding of the First Amendment was not meant to protect libelous speech. So, and he pointed to centuries of common law in England in which it was not only was libelous speech against public figures not protected, but it was actively penalized, right? If you said something, if you uttered something false and defamatory about an elected official or about the king, like that was could face very severe punishments, including imprisonment, and in some cases going back centuries, and you could have your tongue chopped off or your ears chopped off. And so Thomas argued that there was nothing in the Bill of Rights or in the debate surrounding the Bill of Rights that would suggest that the framers wanted libelous speech to be protected. And so that's his argument. I mean, there are a lot of holes in that argument. And there actually are records of the people who drafted the First Amendment thinking that it was important for people not to fear punishment when they were criticizing or speaking about elected officials. And Thomas, in the situation with New York Times versus Sullivan, was taking on a very narrow interpretation historically of what the First Amendment allowed. But in other First Amendment cases, he's taken a much more expansive view, such as when it involves the rights of corporations, for example, to pour tens or if not hundreds of millions of dollars into election campaigns. But I mean, be that as it may, Thomas's argument about the original meaning of the First Amendment, and Thomas is an immensely influential figure in conservative legal circles, and his words carried a lot of weight, and it kind of helped spark this behind the scenes movement to not only overturn Sullivan, but to just across the board make it easier for rich and powerful people and institutions to muzzle critics and shut down unfavorable media coverage.
It's not just Thomas. I know Gorsuch also has added his voice, but are you suggesting that Thomas in particular is trying to murder the truth?
No, I'm not suggesting Thomas in particular is trying to murder the truth. I think that, I mean, Thomas is definitely trying to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. The people who are murdering the truth are the people who are actually making legal threats and filing defamation cases against journalists and members of the public. And that includes a great many people in positions of power, up to and certainly including Donald Trump. Thomas, to my knowledge, has never actually tried to my knowledge, has not tried to use the legal system to silence his critics. He certainly complained a lot about the media, but that's his free speech right to be able to do that.
So where else is the pressure coming from to overturn the New York Times versus Sullivan?
Well, there's a whole network that I detail in the book of a primarily conservative group of lawyers, activists, judges, lawmakers, rich people of various different shapes and sizes all over the country who who kind of took up the call to arms that Thomas issued when he first in 2019 denounced Sullivan. And so it takes many different forms. And one example is that groups like the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society and the Claremont Institute, scholars and activists there started researching the history of Sullivan and started coming up and kind of road testing arguments that could be used to undercut its legitimacy and basically its effectiveness. You also had a small group of very savvy and successful lawyers who had business practices that were basically revolved around bringing lawsuits and making threats against the media. And they started to use their national profiles to call for the overturning of Sullivan. And they found some very sympathetic ears to talk to. I mean, one of these lawyers, her name is Libby Locke, happened to be friendly and kind of allied with Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, who at the time I was kind of in the midst of researching and writing this book, was a leading Republican presidential candidate. And DeSantis has become, aside from Trump, probably the other person who has made the biggest deal about trying to weaken First Amendment protections for journalists. And that's, I think, in part because lawyers and activists like Libby Locke, who's part of a firm called Clare Locke, have been making, they're very articulate and they're making a very strong case in public for curtailing these freedom of the press rights.
So is this something that will eventually get resolved in the Supreme Court as it was originally?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it is currently it's resolved. I mean, the Supreme Court has decided New York Times versus Sullivan. They decided a small handful of subsequent cases that expanded and cemented New York Times versus Sullivan. And so right now, that's the law.
No, my point is, I mean, like with Roe versus Wade, this is something that it can only be overturned by the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can only be overturned by the Supreme Court. And it's unclear how many justices want to do that. Certainly you have Thomas and Gorsuch. You need at least 4 justices to accept a case for review. And obviously you need 5 to form a majority. And I don't know if there are 2 or 3 more votes. I think a more likely scenario, at least in the short run, rather than overturning Sullivan outright, is that there are legal challenges that kind of chip away at it around the edges. And that's actually kind of similar to the strategy we saw opponents of Roe v. Wade using. And but I think, short of New York Times v. Sullivan being overturned or even being diluted, one of the things I've been seeing in my reporting for this book is that all over the country, the very loud calls by Thomas, by Gorsuch, by Trump, by people like Libby Locke to encourage the Supreme Court to overturn Sullivan and to encourage a filing of litigation against the media, it's had a real effect. And you can see it in the volume of lawsuits that are filed against journalists. You can see it in the volume of threats that are made against journalists. And you can see it in the outcome of those cases in court, which even when judges or juries are ultimately ruling in favor of the journalists because they're required to under New York Times versus Sullivan, they are taking longer to do so. and they're allowing these legal processes to run and to become much more protracted than I think they would otherwise be. And the thing I kept seeing over and over again, and kind of the driving motivator for me in writing this book and tackling this topic, is not because I have a particular interest in New York Times versus Sullivan, although I do, and it's not because news outlets like the New York Times will be affected if Sullivan is weakened, although they will. It's that I was seeing all over the country local journalists and independent media being often harassed, threatened, and sued into submission by the people they were writing or speaking about. And I think that there are a lot of dark spots for the media right now. I think one of the bright spots is how there are a lot more independent voices than there were even 5 or 10 years ago. And people like you with a podcast, or someone with a Substack newsletter, or a blogger, or a community news website that replaces the kind of traditional print and ink newspaper that went out of business. And I think that expansion of journalism is really healthy for democracy and really good for our understanding of what's happening at both a local, state, and national level. And I think it's journalists like that that face an existential threat from the weaponization of libel law and these efforts to chip away at New York Times versus Sullivan. Because I work at the New York Times. We have really good in-house lawyers. We're owned by a family that is deeply committed to journalism. And we have a company that's worth, I don't know how much we're worth, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. That is not a privilege that most independent journalists or local journalists or local news outlets have. They operate on shoestring budgets. They are, constantly on the financial knife's edge. And it is often, and I'm not just speculating about this, I've seen this and I told these stories in my book over and over again. And they are often confronted with a choice between facing ruinous financial litigation on the one hand, or backing down and either watering down what they're writing about powerful, litigious local people, or just stop writing about it altogether. And so it's either go out of business or back down. And both of those options are terrible. And I think really run counter to what the First Amendment is supposed to protect. And I think if that comes to fruition, and it's already starting to in some ways, I think it's just like a real disservice to the public in terms of their awareness of what's happening in their own backyards often.
There are lots of stories around this. I know that so New Hampshire Public Radio has been involved. There's a character called Don Blankenship. Tell us about some of the stories, David, that are bubbling up on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a gazillion I could choose from.
What's the most compelling though, in terms of your thesis?
So, I think, like, I'll give you two examples. One involves a local newspaper, the Carroll Times-Herald, which is in Iowa. It was owned by the same family for many generations. And a reporter there named Jared Strong got a tip that a local police officer in the small town was involved in a love triangle involving, among others, a girl in high school. And the reporter and the reporter's publisher both thought that was a newsworthy story. And Jared started reporting on it, confirmed the facts with on-the-record sources and documents. And at that point, went to the local police chief to seek his comment and to check his facts. The local police chief responded by making a phone call that was recorded, in which he threatened the newspaper by saying that if you go ahead with this article, just remember that we have the power to pull over all of your journalists for traffic stops and harass you however we want. They went ahead, to their great credit, and published the story anyway. The cop who was at the center of this love triangle sued the newspaper. And this was on its face a very open and shut defamation case under New York Times versus Sullivan. First of all, the facts of the matter were true. So that means it should be dismissed outright. And even if they weren't true, there was zero evidence that Jared Strong or his newspaper had acted irresponsibly. And so it should have been dismissed quickly. Instead, because of effective lawyering on the other side, and I guess just a kind of amenable judge, this dragged on for a really long time, to such an extent that it nearly bankrupted the newspaper, which had ultimately, the guy whose family had owned it for generations had to sell it to another a company that was not from around there, that was no longer interested in doing investigative journalism. So there's one example. Here's another that's completely different. There's a guy named Scott Stedman who was a blogger. He was straight out of college. He had no journalism experience, but he started a blog that was called Forensic News. And it was basically, Scott was a really intrepid and dogged digger into public records. And he started writing about, with evidence, about the misdeeds and other activities of Russian oligarchs and the people who worked for the Russian oligarchs. And this very quickly attracted some very negative attention from the Russian oligarchs, who were very concerned about what Scott was bringing to light. And so they launched a kind of a multifaceted legal and public relations campaign against Scott, who, after years of going through this, his money was gone. He had suffered such severe panic attacks that he needed to be hospitalized, and he decided he could no longer do this, and eventually reached a settlement in which he, in exchange for not having to pay huge amounts of money, agreed to take down the offending articles about these oligarchs and their enablers, which reflected very badly on them, and ultimately had to shut down his blog and decide to quit journalism because he could no longer stand the abuse he was receiving. So those are two examples of people from very different backgrounds doing very different kinds of journalism, but that were undoubtedly, in my mind, revealing things that the public deserved to know. Their activities should have been protected under New York Times versus Sullivan, because at best, they were doing journalism that was in good faith. They were not trying to get facts wrong. In fact, they're trying to get facts right and reveal the truth. And powerful interests, whether it's the local police department or Russian oligarchs, came down really hard on them and weaponized the legal system in a way that made it impossible for them to keep doing business. And the result was that journalism like that, and in the case of Scott Stedman, the stories he had produced were disappeared. And to me, that is just a very dangerous sign about the state of the First Amendment in this country. And again, those are just two random examples.
Right, and the really troubling thing is that it's what you call this weaponization is taking place when New York Times versus Sullivan is on the books.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. These are things, and that was one of the kind of crystallizing moments I had while reporting and writing this book, is that look at what's happening all over the country with these lawsuits. This is in a country that has some of the best protections for journalists in the world. Imagine what it would be like if we didn't have those protections. It'll be immeasurably worse. And I'm obviously very biased as a journalist, but I just think the world will be a lot worse if you don't have journalists out there who are doing their best to ascertain the truth and to hold powerful people and institutions accountable. And look, I think that is something that really, for a long time, that united people on the left and the right, because the First Amendment and the Sullivan decision protect people regardless of their ideology. There are many examples, which I get into in this book, of conservative groups, whether it's journalists or activists or academics, who get sued and kind of brought to their knees by these weaponized lawsuits by people who they're writing critical things about, powerful people. And so this is not an issue of like the liberal media or whatever. This is an issue about all Americans and all journalists' ability to do their best to tell the truth and to be able to stand up and report on powerful people and institutions that really deserve scrutiny.
The other end of the spectrum, of course, there's Jeff Bezos is the owner of the Washington Post. His decision to end op-eds on politics for the Washington Post. Ruth Marcus, very distinguished Washington Post columnist, resigned and published an interesting piece, Why I Left the Washington Post, in the New Yorker today. Is this phenomenon part of the murdering of the truth, David, or is it something else? Bezos, some people think, is somehow being intimidated by Trump, or at least doesn't want to offend him. But this is a different aspect in the crisis, isn't it?
Well, it certainly seems like Bezos and some other owners of media companies are doing their best not to offend Trump. And it seems like, and again, I don't know this for a fact, this is my informed speculation, that they're doing so because they are worried that if they are sharply critical of Trump in certain ways, that is likely to incur some sort of response from the federal government. And look, with Bezos and the Washington Post, and I agree completely with what you said in terms of what he has done recently with their editorial page and their opinion section, where he is just at the snap of fingers trying to remake it into something whose views almost exclusively reflect views that happen to be kind of prevalent in the White House right now. And to be clear, the other side of the Post, the news side, where there are journalists like working to uncover facts and report the truth, to my knowledge, he has not taken any steps to control or censor what's coming out of the news division of the Washington Post, which continues to do really excellent journalism by a lot of like just absolutely amazing journalists. So I don't want to overstate it, because if Bezos really wanted to suck up to Trump, maybe he would start interfering with the news division too. I certainly hope he doesn't do that. But it's certainly the book at kind of like the broadest level is about powerful people and institutions taking steps that are making it impossible, or at least harder, for the public to know the truth about what is going on in the world. And that, so, under that broad umbrella, you could certainly place a billionaire like Jeff Bezos, who is trying to tilt the opinion section of his newspaper in a way that will please the president. But I wouldn't go so far as to say he is like murdering the truth. I think that Bezos is being maybe kind of complying in advance with what he expects Trump's wishes will be, which is, that's not great for sure.
You used to work for the Wall Street Journal. You were actually involved in a big court case. You were being sued in Britain over some stuff you wrote. I'm very impressed, actually, I have to say, with the Journal's coverage of Trump 2.0, given News Corps and Murdoch's conservatism and the fact that he's supposed to still be close to Trump. It goes without saying that the New York Times has done a good job. Are you impressed also with the Journal? Are they a model, given that they're supposed to be at least conservative?
With the Wall Street Journal? Yeah. I'm very impressed with them. I mean, again, I'm biased because I used to work there and I have a lot of friends who still work there. But yeah, I mean, it's a terrific group of, some of the best journalists in the world work there and would not be working there if they were facing like censorship demands from Murdoch or anyone else. And I think it is in part a testament to those journalists' just, steadfast commitment to producing high quality journalism, regardless of who is in power and regardless of who might come down on them. And I mean, look, I'm always very impressed with the Wall Street Journal. I mean, to be fair, it's like, it should go without saying that professional journalists working for reputable news outlets are going to do their best always to kind of help reveal the truth and to tell things like they see them. And that doesn't mean we're not going to get things wrong. We certainly will. And sometimes we get things really wrong, and that sucks. But in my experience, I have not encountered situations where we're getting things wrong because we're trying to, or because we're lying, or because we are willfully distorting things. So the mistakes tend to be honest ones, good faith mistakes. And so I think I'm not at all surprised to see the Journal's news side continuing to produce really high quality work. And I would be much more surprised if the opposite had happened.
Yeah, it was a great piece recently in the Times. I don't know if you were involved with an investigative piece about the Murdochs themselves. Finally,
had nothing to do with it, but that was a great piece. I totally agree.
Although I have to say, Dave, it's a bit long. I mean, it was the length.
I read every word.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you do. That's what you tell everyone. Finally, David, in broad terms, I mean, sort of we half joked about the title of the book, Murder the Truth. Lots of hysteria, shall we say, about the future of free expression, truth, journalism in the United States. Is there an existential crisis for the truth business in the US at the moment? Do you fear for it in broad terms? I mean, I take your point on the New York Times versus Sullivan, but should we be fearful in an existential sense about the future of the truth in American journalism?
I mean, I don't know. It kind of depends how all those adjectives, what they exactly mean. I mean, I look, this is not something that I'm like lying awake at night wondering, will newspapers exist or will they not exist tomorrow or next week or next year? I think it is this is a continuum. And I think we are at a potentially kind of a pivotal moment in history where, we might not notice. It's like the frog.
Yeah, the frog in the boiling water.
Being boiled. Like these things exist on a continuum. It's often not black and white. And it's not like someone's going to flip a switch and we go from having a free press to not having a free press. I think it's a situation where, 5 or 10 years from now, are we going to look back at this moment and say this was kind of the moment where the campaign against press freedoms really started gaining serious traction and started going from the kind of rhetorical realm into a much more tangible realm, when reporters and news outlets across the country have a lot more trouble writing stories that are seeking to, uncover abuses of power and things like that. And look, I don't think anyone's being hysterical about this, but I think there are people that are very concerned about it, and I'm one of those people. And I think this is a lot of the actions that we've seen out of the Trump administration in the first 2 months are, he's going further than I think any president has gone in the past, with the possible exception of Nixon, to reduce the rights and reduce the kind of flexibility and latitude that journalists historically have had. And I'm seeing all over the country his allies and supporters trying to do the same thing at a state and local level. So I do think this is we could look back on this and see this as a critical moment. But I hope those concerns are misplaced, and they may be. We do, as journalists, I think, like anyone else, when we are worrying about our own futures, we can sometimes worry too much, and hopefully that's the case here.
David Enrich, you may not be losing sleep. I think some people might be after what you said, but you asked the awkward questions. It's a very important new book, Murder the Truth, Fear the First Amendment, and a Secret Campaign to Protect the Powerful. Most of your books are bestsellers. I expect this one will be too. Keep up the good work, David, both at the Times and in your book writing. You are what we need in America today.